Hello, my name is Elisa Duarte, and for my final project, I will be baking something from the Women's Suffrage Cookbook while we explore the question, what aspects pushed the start of this movement and what were the positive and negative effects of it? As reflected by Dr. Graham Warder, 19th century patriarchal America crafted the idea of the perfect home. Warder's depiction of the perfect home is one in which the women nurture their husbands and children into morally elevated beings. Therefore, the idea of a perfect home is simply a construct created by men who see women as morally, intellectually, and politically inferior. As the Constitution and amendments began to solidify in 19th century America, women were eager and determined to be included, considered, and taken seriously in legislation. Women were especially motivated once the Constitution began defining who could vote. According to the final push for suffrage, the origin of the women's rights movement was connected to the end of the Civil War. After women advocates had put their agendas on hold, they expected to continue their fight for equal voting rights. However, the movement was split when the 14th Amendment proposed a question of whether or not to support the freedom of enslaved and black people. This led to the establishment of the first Women's Suffrage Association, the National Women's Suffrage Association, and the American Women's Suffrage Association. Founded by Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton, the NWSA aimed its focus toward gender equality and argued that radical shifts were more important than universal equality. According to scalarcase.edu, the AWSA was initially the more popular association, as its goals were less radical compared to the NWSA. For example, the NWSA supported divorce and voting rights at a federal level, which was considered very radical during this time. Although they had different motives and strategies, both of these associations had one common goal: to allow women to legally vote. In the 1890s, the two movements merged together to create the NAWSA during the Progressive Era. The Progressive Era had a large impact on the societal role of women. According to the Library of Congress, the number of women working went from 2.6 million to 7.8 million by 1910. Although women workers were much less valued and paid than male workers, their contribution to the workforce and industrialism pushed them closer to reaching their goal of women voters. The Seneca Falls Convention pioneered the careers of many suffragists, including some of the most notable, one of them being Susan B. Anthony. Susan B. Anthony, as stated in naps.gov, was motivated to activism when she discovered that the male teachers in her district were paid a $10 salary, while the women were only paid $2.50. She would later go on to meet Elizabeth Cady Stanton, and the two would spend their lives fighting for women's equality and ensuring the passing of the 19th Amendment. Elizabeth Cady Stanton is another prominent figure of this movement. During the Seneca Falls Convention, she would co-write the Declaration of Sentiments, which would introduce the demand for votes for women. This small group of women did the very best that they could with the small number of resources they had access to. Movements, gatherings, protests, and media all cost money to produce in order to get their message out there. One of the ways that these women made money was through fundraisers. They would sell things such as pins, buttons, and especially cookbooks. The Women's Suffrage Cookbook is a compilation of the many recipes shared amongst women suffragists. One of them is the citrus cake that I am making in this video. Another thing that was very commonly fundraised were postcards. As seen in the songs, poems, and postcards of the Women's Suffrage Movement PDF that we saw in class, there are first-hand sources that show us how suffragists perceived the treatment of women and their motives for the creation of this movement, as well as why it was so important for them to be involved in politics. One of these postcards in particular describes who is allowed to vote in America. It labels voters as bad men, dumb men, dead men, and anyone who is male. It labels non-voters as convicts, lunatics, idiots, and women. This message shows that the women of this movement did not want to be categorized with such terrible people and wanted their vote to be valued. This very simple motive was a recurring theme in the rest of these cards. The women's suffrage movement, its powerful women, its persistent movements and activism eventually led to the 19th Amendment, which allowed women to legally vote. This victory marked the beginning of women involvement in politics, which would positively influence the legislative agenda of America until today. However, the suffragist movement and its impacts does not end there. Many new generations of feminism have emerged since the 19th Amendment. It has influenced everything from the Me Too movement to the decision of Roe v. Wade. Thanks to the efforts of the women's suffrage movement, women are coming closer to equality with men, although there is still much work to be done. While it is important to remember what the suffrage movement did for women, it is equally important to remember that many of the suffragist groups only valued the rights of white women, dismissing the rights of black women entirely. Cameron Allen says in one article, "Some believe that allowing Southern white women to vote would preserve the white supremacy by offsetting black men's votes. This tells us the very important fact regarding women's rights and its initial racism. This notion made it even more difficult for black women to gain their rights, since there were women actively dehumanizing them as well. This important part of history too frequently goes unnoticed. By remembering this part of the suffrage movement, we can acknowledge the deep-rooted racism of this country and its initial attention to preserve white supremacy. This is the first step to growing out of that thinking and creating a nation in which all are equal regardless of race, color, gender, religion, and any other qualities." The women's suffrage movement was motivated by many societal, political, and economic factors. The basis of it was to fight against systemic exclusion of women from political and social power. Women did not want to be confined by the male's description of the perfect home, and they demanded change. It is through understanding the motives of this movement that we can appreciate its achievements and acknowledge its mistakes in order to create a more inclusive country.